In the gilded cages of the global elite, legacy is the only true currency, and history is a weapon wielded by the powerful. But what happens when that power, insulated by wealth and cynicism, is confronted by a truth it cannot buy? This is the story of a waitress, invisible to the world, her mind a museum of forgotten knowledge, and a billionaire sheikh, a man whose rage could shatter empires. He was about to incinerate a restaurant, a career, and a multi-billion-dollar pact with a single, furious exit. But a lone voice, speaking not just a language but the very history he held sacred, made him freeze, as if turned to stone. This is not a story about magic. It is the story of how a forgotten piece of the past became the key to the future. The air in Ethelgard, a restaurant so discreet it was known only by a whispered name among the city's power brokers, was thick with the scent of aged leather, truffle oil, and calculated ambition. For Elara Vance, it smelled of exhaustion and the faint, metallic tang of fear. Each soft chime of hand-forged silverware against custom porcelain was a note in a symphony of wealth she could only serve, never conduct. Her uniform, a simple but impeccably tailored black dress, felt less like attire and more like a cloak of invisibility. Elara was not meant for this life of silent servitude. Her girlhood was a mosaic of dusty archives and sun-drenched excavation sites in Jordan and Syria. Her grandfather, Dr. Alistair Vance, had not been a diplomat or a businessman, but a celebrated historian and epigrapher, one of the world's foremost experts on Nabatean and early Kufic script. Her lullabies were ancient poems. Her picture books were her grandfather's meticulous sketches of rock inscriptions. English was the language of her home, but Arabic, in its classical, scholarly form, was the language of her soul. She had grown up seeing the world not as a map of nations, but as a tapestry of overlapping histories. That world had crumbled to dust. Alistair's long illness had consumed his savings, and his death left Elara and her grandmother with a legacy of priceless knowledge and a mountain of very practical debt. Now, home was a cramped apartment where the scent of old books mingled with the reality of unpaid bills. Her world, once stretching across millennia, had shrunk to the polished floors of Ethelgard. In her sparse free time, she didn't watch television. She practiced calligraphy on cheap paper, tracing the elegant, angular lines of scripts few people living could still read, a secret communion with the ghost of the man who had shaped her. Tonight, the restaurant's usual quiet intensity was dialed to a near unbearable pitch. The energy was centered on a single table in the most secluded private dining room, Table 1. This was the temporary throne of Kalen Al-Jamil, the formidable CEO of Jamil Global, a conglomerate whose reach extended from advanced desalination technology to historic preservation projects across the Middle East. Forbes called him the Desert Hawk. His staff, it was rumored, called him the Scythe for the way he cut through incompetence. He possessed a severe, almost ascetic handsomeness, with eyes the color of dark coffee that seemed to analyze rather than see, and a stillness that promised devastating action. He was dining with Marcus Thorne, the CEO of the American behemoth Titan Development. Thorne was a man who radiated a different kind of power, loud, expansive, and slick with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. His smile was a billboard for a product you didn't trust. Elara had been assigned the table by Mr. Dubois, the restaurant's manager, a man as polished and brittle as the crystal he oversaw. "Vance," Dubois had murmured, his voice a silken threat. "Mr. Al-Jamil's patronage is a cornerstone of this establishment. You are to be atmosphere. A phantom. Do you understand?" For the first 90 minutes, Elara was precisely that. She moved with an economy of motion honed by years of practice, refilling glasses of still water, presenting courses with a reverence that belied the burning ache in her feet. The conversation at the table was a chess match, played with poisoned pieces. Thorne and his team were all back-slapping bonhomie and aggressive optimism, while Kalen Al-Jamil and his two aides were paragons of stoic reserve. He barely registered her presence, gesturing for more water with an almost imperceptible flick of his fingers, his attention fixed on a series of architectural plans spread across the table. Elara felt the familiar pang of being erased, of being reduced to a function. She remembered sitting at her grandfather's crowded dinner table, debating the meaning of a newly discovered inscription with visiting scholars, her opinion sought and valued. Here, her only value lay in her silence and her swiftness. She was clearing the plates from the appetizer course when the first crack in the evening's facade appeared. Thorne, attempting to build rapport, gestured dismissively at the plans. "Look, Kalen, we both know the real value here is the land. Your insistence on preserving that pile of rocks on the south quadrant is costing us weeks. It's a sentimental bottleneck." Kalen Al-Jamil's eyes, which had been scanning a geological survey, lifted slowly. A perceptible drop in temperature chilled the room. "That pile of rocks, Marcus, is the remnant of a Nabatean watchtower. It has stood for 2,000 years. Thorne chuckled, a grating, dismissive sound, and it'll make a great story for the resort's brochure, built on historic ground. But let's be real, it's rubble. Our bulldozers are state-of-the-art. We can clear it, catalogue it, and have a replica built by the lobby fountain in a month. Progress, my friend." Elara's hand, holding a silver tray, tightened. The casual, profound ignorance of the statement was like a physical blow. She knew that watchtower, not from a survey, but from her grandfather's journals. He had spent a summer there, meticulously documenting the faint inscriptions at its base, speculating they were a message from a lonely sentry watching the trade caravans pass. To hear it reduced to lobby decor sent a wave of cold fury through her. She retreated to the kitchen, her composure fraying. It wasn't just the insult, it was the entire grotesque performance, the obscene amounts of money being discussed while she worried about her grandmother's pharmacy bills, the reduction of a rich, layered history into a marketing gimmick. The ghost of her grandfather seemed to be standing beside her, his face etched with a familiar, scholarly sorrow. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed her apron, and prepared to re-enter the lion's den. The main course was on its way, and the night was about to detonate. The Wagyu steaks arrived, seared to perfection, resting on beds of saffron-infused risotto. Elara served the plates with the seamless, impersonal grace Dubois demanded. But the air at table 1 was no longer just tense, it was toxic. The thin veneer of professional courtesy had been sandblasted away, revealing the raw, unyielding core of two opposing worldviews. Marcus Thorne, his face flushed from expensive wine and growing impatience, leaned forward, stabbing a finger at the architectural plans. "With all due respect, Kalen, our offer is more than fair. We're offering a 20% premium over market value for the land, and our construction timeline is aggressive. We're bringing jobs, infrastructure. This isn't a charity project. It's a paradigm of modern development." Kalen Al-Jamil placed his knife and fork beside his untouched steak with a quiet, deliberate finality. "Your paradigm, Marcus, involves diverting water from local agricultural lands and building a golf course that is ecologically unsustainable in a desert environment. You see land, and you see a commodity to be exploited. I see a trust, a legacy to be honored." "Oh, let's not get poetic," Thorne scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "This is how the world works. You can't let nostalgia stand in the way of $1 billion return. It's just desert. We're making it valuable. That was the word. The single, arrogant, colonizing word that broke the dam of Kalen's control. Valuable. The implication that the land, with its 2 millennia of history, its delicate ecosystem, its connection to his ancestors, was worthless until a man like Marcus Thorne arrived to pave it over. Kalen's face became a mask of cold, concentrated rage. He pushed his chair back, the heavy wood scraping harshly against the stone floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the hushed opulence of Ethelgard. "This meeting is over," he stated. The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of a decree. His 2 aides, silent sentinels until this moment, rose in perfect sync, gathering their documents. Dubois, who had been observing from a distance with the anxious air of a bomb disposal expert, scurried over, his face a waxy shade of pale. "Mr. Al-Jamil, is everything all right? Is the steak not to your satisfaction?" "The chef can—" Kalen looked through him as if he were made of smoke. His entire focus was a laser beam directed at the now flustered Thorne. "You sit at my table, you insult my intelligence, and you display a staggering ignorance that you mistake for pragmatism. You believe your money absolves you of the need for respect. You are mistaken." He turned to one of his aides and began speaking in rapid, biting Arabic. Elara, frozen in place by the table, felt the words pass through her, not as a foreign tongue, but as a language she understood to her bones. It was a formal, educated dialect, sharpened to a razor's edge by his fury. "Inform the pilot the jet is to be wheels up in 2 hours. Cancel all my appointments in this city, and draft a press release. Jamil Global is pulling all prospective investments from North American markets, effective immediately. Cite a fundamental divergence in corporate ethics. I want their stock to open in hell tomorrow morning." The aide nodded grimly, his fingers already flying across his phone. Thorne stood up, sputtering. "Now hold on, Kalen. This is a simple misunderstanding. We can talk this through." But Kalen had already turned his back on him, a vortex of controlled Arctic fury striding toward the exit. Dubois was babbling, wringing his hands, a man watching his career go up in flames. The ambient chatter of the entire restaurant had ceased. Every diner was watching the spectacular implosion of a mega deal. Elara watched it all, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the deal vanishing, she saw Dubois' career ending, and she saw, with absolute certainty, that she would be fired as collateral damage. But beneath the fear was a deeper, more primal feeling. It was an echoing rage on Kalen's behalf. Thorne's casual vandalism of history had struck a deeply personal chord, awakening the part of her that was her grandfather's student, the keeper of his legacy. Everything was about to be lost, shattered by arrogance and a failure to communicate. As Kalen Al-Jamil reached the grand archway, leading out of the main dining room, his path to freedom clear, Elara did the one thing she was expressly forbidden to do. She moved, and she spoke. Just as Kalen Al-Jamil's hand-stitched Italian leather shoe was about to cross the threshold into the lobby, a woman's voice, clear and steady, sliced through the chaotic silence. It wasn't Dubois' panicked apologies or Thorne's blustering protests. It was a voice speaking a language no one in that room, save for 3 men, was expected to understand. "La tasabana an-naqsha ala al-hijara, bal al-ma'na alladhi fi qalb al-hajar." The words were spoken in flawless, classical Arabic, the formal, poetic tongue of scholars and ancient texts. It wasn't the dialect of the street or the boardroom. It was the language of history itself. The pronunciation was impeccable, the cadence lyrical. It translated to do not consider the inscription on the stone, but the meaning within the heart of the stone." It was a quote, a direct, albeit obscure quote from the 12th century Andalusian philosopher Ibn Rushd, a commentary on the importance of seeing beyond the surface to the deeper truth. More than that, it was a direct, scholarly rebuke to Thorne's dismissal of the watchtower as a mere pile of rocks. Kalen al-Jamil froze mid-stride. His entire body went rigid, his forward momentum crashing against an invisible intellectual wall. He stopped so suddenly that his aide, moving to open the door for him, nearly stumbled. The titanic force of his anger was instantly arrested. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. His dark eyes swept the room, searching for the source of that impossible voice. The restaurant was now so quiet one could hear the soft hiss of the gas lamps. Diners stared, their forks suspended in mid-air. Dubois looked as if he might faint. Marcus Thorne and his team gaped, utterly clueless as to the content of the phrase, but acutely aware of its stunning, paralyzing effect. Kalen's eyes found her. Ilara. Standing by the wreckage of Table 1, her posture ramrod straight, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. The terror was a storm inside her, but her voice had been a lighthouse beam. She had not offered a simple proverb. She had offered a counter-argument, a piece of evidence from the shared cultural library he thought he was defending alone. He stared at the waitress, this anonymous woman in a simple black dress, and for the first time that evening, he truly saw her. He saw the fierce intelligence in her clear grey eyes, the proud, defiant set of her jaw. There was no trace of the subservient phantom now. She met his intense gaze without flinching, holding it. He took one slow, deliberate step back into the dining room, then another. His expression was a complex storm of disbelief, suspicion, and a powerful, overriding curiosity. His aides exchanged confused, wary glances, falling back into formation behind him. He spoke to her in Arabic, his tone no longer white-hot with rage, but sharp, demanding, and laced with suspicion. "Man anti? ومن أين لنادلة فهذه المدنة أن تتحدث لغة كأنها ولدت عليها?" "Who are you? And how does a waitress in this city speak my language as if she were born to it?" Ilara replied in the same classical form, her voice even, though it cost her every ounce of her resolve. "Ism Ilara Vance, Lamat alamha ya Sayyid, Bal atadakaruha min Beit Judd." "My name is Ilara Vance. I did not learn it, sir. Rather, I remember it from my grandfather's house." She chose the formal term for remember, and referred not just to a home, but specifically to her grandfather's house, a subtle signal of lineage and learning. Something shifted in Kalen's eyes. The fury was still present, a banked fire, but it was being rapidly overshadowed by a disarming, profound intrigue. He had been drowning in a sea of opportunistic fools who saw his culture as either an obstacle or an ornament. And now this waitress, this ghost, had spoken to the very heart of the argument, to the core of his intellectual and ancestral identity, with a single, perfectly aimed quote. He glanced at the utterly bewildered face of Marcus Thorne. He looked at the panicking, useless Dubois. His gaze finally returned to Ilara. In that suspended moment, a decision was made, one that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of the night and of her life. He gestured curtly to his aides. "Intazirun afah as-sayyara," he commanded in Arabic. "Wait for me in the car." Then, switching to an English so cold and authoritative it made the air crystallize, he addressed the room. To Thorne he said, "Our business is concluded for the evening. Do not contact me." To Dubois he said, "Clear this room. Now. I require privacy." And to Ilara, his voice a low, intense command that left no room for argument, he said, You are not going anywhere. Sit down. We have much to discuss." The silence that descended after Kaylan al-Jamil's series of pronouncements was absolute, broken only by the frantic, scurrying sounds of Dubois personally ushering the stunned and indignant Titan development team out of the private dining room. He gave Ilara a look of pure venom as he passed, a silent promise of future retribution, before pulling the heavy oak doors shut, leaving them alone. Ilara stood in the opulent isolation of the room with the billionaire, the half-eaten, fantastically expensive dinner sitting between them like the debris of a battlefield. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiant act was draining away, leaving a cold, terrifying vacuum in its wake. She had shattered every rule of her employment. Her termination was a foregone conclusion. "Sit," Kaylan repeated, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. He gestured to the plush, damask-covered chair opposite his own, the one Marcus Thorne had so recently and disastrously occupied. With a tremor she hoped wasn't visible, Ilara sat. The starched linen of her uniform felt absurd against the luxurious upholstery. She was acutely aware of her practical, worn-out server's shoes on the priceless Persian rug. She folded her hands in her lap, bracing for the inevitable dismissal. Kaylan also sat, leaning forward, his forearms on the table, creating an atmosphere of intense intimacy. He didn't speak immediately. He simply studied her, his analytical eyes probing, as if trying to reconcile the silent phantom from earlier with the scholar who had just quoted Ibn Rushd. "Ilara Vance," he said finally, the name sounding foreign and significant on his tongue. "You said you remember the language from your grandfather's house. Your grandfather was—" Taking a breath that felt like her first in an hour, Ilara told him. She didn't speak of debt or struggle. She spoke of Dr. Alistair Vance, the epigrapher. She told him of a childhood spent deciphering facsimiles of ancient texts, of summers spent in the shade of ruins he was documenting, of the smell of old paper and cardamom tea that defined her youth. She spoke of his passion for the preservation of history, not as a collection of relics, but as a living dialogue with the past. As she spoke, she saw the hard, corporate armor around Kaylan begin to soften, replaced by an expression of dawning recognition. "Alistair Vance," Kaylan said, a note of awe in his voice. "I have read his work. His monograph on pre-Islamic poetry in the Hijaz is required reading for my foundation's board. He was a giant." He looked at her then, truly seeing the lineage she carried not in her blood, but in her mind. "You are his granddaughter." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of discovery, of a puzzle piece clicking into place. "He taught me that a culture's strength is measured by what it chooses to remember," she said softly. Kaylan leaned back, a grim smile touching his lips. "And Marcus Thorne and his kind measure it by what they can profitably forget. They see a historical site and see only the impediment to a golf course. They don't understand that to erase history is to insult the future." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "What you did was reckless, a flagrant breach of every protocol. Your manager wants you crucified." Ilara's stomach twisted. "I am aware. However," he continued, holding up a hand to forestall her, "it was also the most strategically brilliant maneuver I have witnessed in a decade. You didn't just speak Arabic, Ms. Vance. You spoke my own convictions back to me. You understood the principle behind the argument, not just the profit and loss." He fell silent for a long, contemplative moment. The gears of a formidable mind were turning, reassessing, reformulating. Ilara held her breath. What he said next was not what she expected. It was not a job offer. It was a challenge. "This deal with Titan Development is not dead," he began, his voice shifting back into the clipped, strategic tone of a CEO. "It is merely in critical condition. Thorn is a blunt instrument, but he controls a distribution network in North America that I require for a different, more important venture. He is, regrettably, a necessary evil, but he and his people are culturally illiterate. They need a guide, a translator who understands not just vocabulary, but context, value, history." He leaned forward again, the full force of his intensity focused on her. "Thorn's team insulted me. They will never have my trust. But I am willing to give them one final chance to be educated. I am resuming negotiations in 2 days. I want you at that table." Ilara stared, bewildered. "At the table? Sir, I'm a waitress. I have no experience in corporate law or finance." "I am not interested in your experience as a waitress," he countered swiftly. "I have enough lawyers and financiers to fill a stadium. They can speak the language of contracts. I need someone who can speak the language of legacy. I don't want you to negotiate the price of steel. I want you to ensure they understand the price of disrespect. I will pay you a consultant's fee for the duration of the negotiations." He named a figure that made Ilara's head spin. It was more than she earned in 3 years at Ethelgard. It was enough to settle the most pressing of her grandfather's medical debts, to give her grandmother a cushion of security she hadn't had in years. I don't have appropriate attire," she stammered, the practical objection sounding feeble even to her own ears. "My assistant will rectify the issue of your wardrobe," he said, waving the concern away as a triviality. "Your knowledge is your attire, Ms. Vance. It is armor that men like Thorn cannot comprehend, let alone pierce. Your only task is to be the voice of your grandfather in that room. Ensure that what is sacred is not treated as transactional." He stood, signaling the meeting was over. "A car will be sent for you tomorrow morning. My office will be in touch to arrange the details and provide a preliminary briefing. Read everything. I will expect you to be prepared." He walked toward the door, then paused, his hand on the handle, and looked back at her. The analytical gleam was back in his eyes, now tinged with a sliver of something that might have been hope. "There is one thing you should know, Miss Vance." "What is that?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "I am not a sentimental man. I am giving you this opportunity not out of kindness, but because I believe you may be a uniquely valuable asset. Prove me right." He gave a single sharp nod and was gone, leaving Ilara alone in the silent, opulent room. She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see them trembling, but they were steady. She had walked into Ethelgard that night as a waitress, a phantom in a black dress. She was about to walk into a new life, armed with nothing but the words of the dead and the convictions of the living. The trial had just begun. The following 36 hours were a dizzying immersion into a world she had only ever observed from the periphery. A sleek, silent town car collected her from her modest apartment building, the driver treating her with a deference that was both unnerving and exhilarating. At Kaelin's direction, his assistant, a terrifyingly efficient woman named Zara, had overseen the delivery of a rack of exquisitely tailored business attire. Trying on a charcoal grey suit that fit as if it were custom-made, Ilara felt a strange sense of clicking into place, the external shell finally matching the sharp, analytical mind it housed. The bulk of her time was spent in a temporary office in the Al Jamil corporate suite, drowning in data. She devoured geological surveys, environmental impact reports, financial projections, and most importantly, the dense legal framework of the proposed deal. She worked with a ferocity born of desperation and purpose, cross-referencing clauses, highlighting ambiguities, and making notes in the margins in her neat academic script. She wasn't just reading. She was learning the battlefield. When she walked into the penthouse boardroom 2 days later, she was no longer Elara Vance, the waitress. She was Ms. Vance, special consultant, her mind humming with information, her presence fortified by preparation. The atmosphere was thick with resentment. Marcus Thorne and his team were seated at one side of a vast mahogany table, their expressions sullen. They looked at Elara with a mixture of contempt and confusion as she took her seat not behind Kalen, but beside him. "A new addition to the team, Kalen?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Taking restaurant recommendations now, are we?" Before Elara could feel the sting, Kalen answered, his voice as cool and smooth as the polished marble floor. "Ms. Vance is not a recommendation, Marcus. She is my new senior advisor for cultural and historical significance. Her input is non-negotiable. I suggest you listen to what she has to say." Thorne's smirk faltered. The day was a masterclass in trench warfare. Elara's role was far more complex than Kalen had initially defined. She became a cultural filter, a strategic amplifier. When Thorne's legal team presented a clause about land use, phrasing it in aggressive, absolute terms, Titan Development reserves the right to alter or remove any existing geological or man-made structures. She would lean over and whisper to Kalen in Arabic. "Sir, their language is that of conquest, not partnership. It lacks any acknowledgement of protected status. It is a deliberate provocation." Then, addressing Thorne's team in calm, measured English, she would reframe the entire concept. "Mr. Al-Jamil proposes an amendment. All development will be preceded by a joint archaeological survey. Any sites deemed historically significant will not be obstacles, but will be integrated into the final design as protected cultural assets, enhancing the project's prestige and value." She was a shield and a sword. She deftly translated Kalen's passionate Arabic statements about legacy and ancestral duty into the cold, corporate vernacular Thorne's team could understand. She transformed his arguments about honor into discussions about long-term brand integrity and sustainable heritage marketing. She saw the grudging respect begin to dawn in Kalen's eyes, and the mounting frustration in Thorne's. He was used to controlling the narrative, but she was consistently outmaneuvering him, using a language of value he couldn't quantify or dismiss. The dynamic was not lost on Kalen's own team. His lead counsel and second-in-command, a stern, older man named Faris, watched her with a hawk-like intensity. During a break, he approached her by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "You have his ear, Ms. Vance," Faris stated, his tone neutral, but his eyes cold. "An impressive feat. I'm simply providing context Mr. Al-Jamil feels is important," she replied carefully. "Be cautious," Faris warned, his voice dropping. "His passion for these matters is his greatest strength, but it can also be a vulnerability. Men like Thorne will seek to exploit it, and those who encourage that passion become targets themselves. You are an outsider, a novelty. Do not mistake a temporary strategic advantage for a permanent position of power." The warning was clear. She was useful, but she was also expendable. She was a pawn in a much larger game, navigating not only the open hostility of the American team, but also the subtle currents of jealousy and politics within Kalen's own inner circle. She had his attention, but she had not yet truly earned his trust. That, she knew, would require more than just a well-placed quote. The breakthrough, and the beginning of the end, came on the third day. The negotiations had stalled on the most contentious point: the watchtower. Thorne was immovable, seeing it as $1 million delay. Kaelin was equally adamant, viewing its preservation as the soul of the entire project. During a tense recess, Ilara was reviewing her grandfather's digital archives on her tablet when she found it. A high-resolution photograph of the watchtower's base, showing the faint, weathered inscriptions he had documented 30 years ago. One line of text was clearer than the others. She recognized the script immediately. It was a variation of Nabatean Aramaic, notoriously difficult to translate. But her grandfather had been a master. His notes were beside the image. When the meeting resumed, she calmly projected the image onto the large screen in the boardroom. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice steady, "you have referred to this as a pile of rocks. I would like to offer a more precise definition." She pointed to the inscription. "This text, carved nearly 2,000 years ago, is not a poem or a decree. According to my grandfather's translation, it is a boundary marker. It reads, 'This land is a trust from the heavens. Its water belongs to the thirsty, its shade to the weary, and its heart to the generations to come.' It is, in effect, one of the oldest conservation easements in human history." The room fell silent. She had not made an emotional appeal. She had presented a legal precedent, written in stone. She had taken Thorne's argument about practicality and turned it on its head, using history as indisputable evidence. Marcus Thorne stared at the screen, speechless. He had no counter-argument. How could he argue against the words of the very people whose land he was trying to develop? Kaelin looked at the screen, then at Ilara. The look in his eyes was no longer one of respect. It was one of profound, unvarnished awe. He hadn't just hired a translator. He had found a guardian of his legacy. Later that evening, back in the quiet sanctuary of her hotel suite, she felt a sense of belonging that had been absent for years. The work was demanding, the stakes terrifying, but for the first time since her grandfather's death, she felt whole. She was using the knowledge he had gifted her, not as a hobby, but as a tool to shape the world. An encrypted email chimed on her laptop. It was from Kaelin's personal account. The subject, "For your eyes only." Inside was a single, protected document, the final, confidential draft of their absolute bottom-line offer. It contained the tiered concession strategy, the sensitive financial analytics of Jamil Global's investment arm, and, most critically, the walkaway number, the lowest possible figure they would accept, a number known only to Kaelin, Faris, and now her. It was more than a document. It was the key to the kingdom. It was the ultimate test and the ultimate gesture of trust. With a deep breath, she opened the file, her mind already preparing for the final battle tomorrow, ready to stand beside him, not just as an advisor, but as an ally. She meticulously memorized the key figures, the strategic weak points, the final line of defense. As she powered down her laptop, the city lights below seemed to glitter with promise. She allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future beyond just paying the bills, a future of purpose. She awoke the next morning feeling like a general on the dawn of a decisive victory. She chose a suit the color of cobalt blue, its sharp lines a reflection of her newfound confidence. When she stepped off the elevator onto the penthouse floor, however, the triumphant feeling curdled into a ball of ice in her stomach. The energy was wrong. The air was not charged with anticipation. It was dead and cold, like the silence after an execution. Thorne and his team were on one side of the room, their usual brashness replaced by a quiet, predatory smugness. Marcus Thorne himself was leaning against the table, a venomous, triumphant smile playing on his lips. On the other side stood Kaelin's team. Faris looked grave and agitated, but it was Kaelin who broke her heart. He was standing by the window, his back to the room, but the rigid line of his shoulders conveyed a fury so immense it had gone past heat and turned to Arctic ice. "What's wrong?" Elara whispered as she approached Faris. Before he could answer, Thorn's voice boomed across the room, thick with mock sympathy. "Ah, the senior advisor has arrived. We were just admiring your handiwork, Miss Vance." Kaelin turned then, slowly, and the look in his eyes was a physical blow. The awe, the respect, the burgeoning partnership, all of it was gone. In its place was a desolate landscape of utter betrayal. He looked at her as if she were a viper he had foolishly welcomed into his house. "Last night," Thorn continued, savouring each syllable, "in a shocking and anonymous act of corporate conscience, we received an email. It contained some illuminating attachments." He tapped a tablet on the table, turning the screen so she could see. Elara's world buckled. Displayed in stark black and white was the confidential proposal. Her proposal. The one sent to her, and only her, just hours before. Every concession, every strategy, every last decimal point of your walkaway number, Thorn purred, his eyes gleaming with victory. It seems the price of historical significance isn't as high as the price of cold, hard cash. The deal we discussed yesterday is of course off the table. Our new offer, which reflects this new transparency, is on its way. The sabotage was perfect, a kill shot to the heart of their entire negotiating position. Kaelin's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't look at her, but addressed Faris. "How many people had access to that file, Faris?" Faris wrung his hands, the picture of distressed loyalty. "Only the most senior inner circle, sir. Myself, the CFO, and—" He let his voice drop, casting a sorrowful, damning glance at Elara. "You authorized access for Ms. Vance last night." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "A waitress from a downtown restaurant," one of Thorn's executives chimed in, shaking his head in mock pity. "Desperate people do desperate things, Kaelin. She saw a chance for a bigger payday from us. And she took it. Can't say I blame her. It's just business." Every word was another nail being hammered into her coffin. They had built the perfect narrative. The poor, clever girl given a taste of a better life, who immediately sold out for a bigger one. It was simple, ugly, and to everyone in that room, it was utterly plausible. She turned to Kaelin, her heart shattering. "I didn't do this," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Kaelin, you have to believe me. I would never betray you." She took a step towards him, her eyes pleading. "I swear on my grandfather's memory." At the mention of her grandfather, a flicker of something, doubt, pain, crossed his face. For a single, breathtaking second, she thought she had broken through. But then the wall of ice slammed down again, colder and harder than before. He had allowed himself to trust an outsider, to be swayed by her intellect and her connection to his past. And this was the result: public, catastrophic humiliation. His pride, the bedrock of his very identity, had been demolished, and she was the architect of his ruin. "Leave the room, Miss Vance," he commanded. The voice was flat, dead, devoid of all emotion, which was 1,000 times worse than shouting. It was the voice of a judge dismissing a case that had already been lost. "Go to your suite. Await instructions." The dismissal was total. It was an excommunication. As she walked toward the door, on legs that felt like they were made of stone, she felt the burn of Thorn's triumphant smirk and Faris's righteous glare on her back. The short, brilliant flight was over. She was plummeting back to a world worse than the one she had left, branded not as a failure, but as a traitor. The click of the hotel suite's heavy door was the sound of a cell being locked. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening, a palpable entity pressing in on her from all sides. The vast, luxurious room, once a symbol of her impossible ascent, was now a gilded prison. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the cool silk of the duvet, a cruel mockery of comfort. Humiliation, hot and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through her shock. She kept seeing Kaelin's face, the utter and complete revulsion in his eyes. He hadn't just fired her. He had judged, convicted, and sentenced her without a trial. He thought her a common thief, that her loyalty, her passion for his cause, her grandfather's legacy, all of it had a price tag, and that she had sold it to the lowest bidder. A wave of despair threatened to pull her under. She thought of the hopeful conversations with her grandmother, the plans she had started to make. It had all been a mirage in the desert. The instinct to flee was overwhelming. To pack her original, threadbare clothes and vanish back into the anonymity she had come from. She forced herself to stand and walk to the mirror. She saw a stranger in a cobalt blue suit, a ghost in expensive armor, her face a pale mask of disbelief. But as she stared into her own reflected eyes, she saw something else flicker beneath the pain, the stubborn, defiant glint of her grandfather's intellect. They had all underestimated her. Thorne with his brutish greed, Faris with his serpentine jealousy, and even Kaelin with his proud, wounded blindness. They saw a waitress. They saw a desperate girl. They had no idea who she was. She closed her eyes, and her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, a calm whisper from years past. Elara. Most people only look for the obvious weapon, the sword, the gun, but the most dangerous weapon is always the one no one sees. It's the misplaced word, the subtle gesture, the detail everyone else overlooks. Observation, my dear girl, is the sharpest blade of all. The thought was a splash of icy water. She stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like an investigator. She began to rewind the past week, scene by scene, not with emotion, but with cold academic precision. She replayed every meeting, every conversation, every glance. And then it coalesced, a detail she had registered, but not processed. The break, 2 days ago. Faris, Kaelin's trusted second-in-command, and one of Thorne's junior analysts, a nervous, twitchy young man named Peterson, standing in a quiet corridor. It wasn't a casual chat. Faris had been speaking in a low, intense voice, and he had handed Peterson a thin, elegant-looking fountain pen. Peterson had taken it, nodded, and practically fled. At the time, she'd thought it was an odd, perhaps condescending, gesture. A powerful man gifting a trifle to an underling. But the pen, it hadn't looked like a gift. It looked like a delivery. Her mind caught fire. A pen. A modern, high-end fountain pen. What else could it be? A USB drive. A cleverly disguised piece of spyware. It was a classic piece of corporate espionage tradecraft. Her hands flew to her laptop. She didn't have access to Kaelin's security teams or forensic experts. They were already building a case against her. She needed to build a better one, faster. She had only one lifeline, a ghost from her grandfather's world. Dr. Anya Sharma, a cybersecurity professor at Georgetown, who had been one of Alistair's dearest friends, and a frequent guest at their dinner table debates. Anya owed her nothing, but she had adored her grandfather. "Anya, it's Elara Vance," she said, her voice tight and urgent when the professor answered. "I'm in terrible trouble. I need to know if it's possible to embed a keystroke logger or a data exfiltration device into a high-end fountain pen. And if so, How would one activate it? There was a pause, then Anya's brisk, academic voice. Possible. Ilara, it's practically an off-the-shelf item for intelligence agencies. High-capacity, short-range wireless transmitter. You'd need a receiver nearby to capture the data. The pen itself would look and function perfectly normally. As for activation, it could be anything. A specific sequence of clicks, a twist of the cap, or proximity to the receiver. Proximity to the receiver. The final piece clicked into place. The leak hadn't happened when she was alone in her room. It had happened in the boardroom itself. Faris had given Peterson the pen. Peterson, sitting in every meeting, had been the unwitting mule. And Faris, sitting just a few feet away with a receiver, perhaps in his briefcase or his own phone, had been capturing every keystroke as she and Kalen worked on their confidential documents in real time. He hadn't needed to hack her email. He had simply stolen the information as it was being created. And the final critical document she reviewed last night? He had captured it all. He had framed her perfectly. Now for the end game. She couldn't just present this theory. They would call her a desperate, paranoid liar. She needed proof. She needed to force a confession. With trembling fingers, she composed a text message directly to Kalen's personal number. She had one shot to pierce through his wall of pride and betrayal. I did not betray you. Faris did. He used one of Thorne's analysts. The proof is not digital, it is physical. Get everyone back in that boardroom. Tell them you are prepared to sign Thorne's new, insulting offer. It is imperative that Faris believes he has won. Trust me one last time. I swear on your legacy and my grandfather's name. She hit send, her heart hammered against her ribs. She was asking the proudest man she had ever met to feign utter defeat based on the word of the woman he believed had broken him. It was an insane gamble. An hour later, a knock came at her door. It was one of Kalen's personal security guards. Mr. Al-Jamil requires your presence in the boardroom. She walked down the corridor, her spine straight, her steps measured. This was not a walk of shame. It was a walk toward the gallows, with a slim, desperate hope of a pardon. The scene in the boardroom was one of gloating victory. Thorne and his team were laughing, champagne flutes in hand. Kalen was standing by the table, his face a mask of grim resignation, playing his part perfectly. He met her eyes as she entered, and for a fraction of a second she saw a flicker of something. Not trust, but a desperate willingness to see this through. He gave a nod so subtle it was almost invisible. He had received her message. He had rolled the dice. Well, well, Thorne sneered. Come to watch the surrender? Ilara ignored him. She walked calmly to the center of the room, her presence radiating a strange, unexpected authority that silenced the chatter. She turned her gaze not to Kalen, not to Thorne, but directly to the nervous junior analyst, Peterson. Mr. Peterson, she began, her voice quiet but resonant. That's a very handsome fountain pen you have. Peterson flinched, his hand instinctively going to his jacket pocket. Faris, standing near Kalen, went rigid. A gift, I presume, Ilara continued, her eyes boring into the young analyst. From Mr. Faris. He's a very generous man. But gifts like that, they sometimes come with hidden features. For example, a short-range data transmitter, which would allow someone sitting nearby to capture every single thing typed on a laptop. Peterson's face went white. Thorne stared, utterly confused. This is an absurd and libelous accusation, Faris boomed, stepping forward, his face a mask of outrage. She is a cornered traitor, inventing fantasies to save herself. It was then that Kalen finally moved. With slow, deliberate grace, he walked to the head of the table. Is it a fantasy? Faris?" he asked, his voice lethally calm, "because I find myself wondering. If I were to have my security team retrieve that pen from Mr. Peterson right now, and if they were to find such a device, Marcus," he turned his gaze to Thorn, "that would constitute corporate espionage of the highest order. It would not only nullify this deal, it would trigger lawsuits that would cripple your company for a decade. Are you willing to stake your entire enterprise on the word of my trusted advisor here?" It was a masterful bluff, built on her theory, delivered with absolute certainty. The pressure in the room became unbearable. Peterson broke. A choked sob escaped his lips. "I didn't know," he cried, pulling the pen from his pocket and throwing it on the table as if it were a snake. Faris! He told me it was a gesture of goodwill. He said I should use it to take notes. I didn't know what it was, I swear." The confession hung in the air, glittering and deadly. Thorn stared at Faris, his face a picture of dawning horror, as he realized he had been played not by the waitress, but by Kaelin's own right-hand man. Kaelin's security team materialized in the doorway, their presence silent and final. They flanked a pale, speechless Faris and the weeping Peterson, and escorted them from the room. In the ringing silence that followed, Kaelin al-Jamil walked over to Ilara. The ice in his eyes had melted, replaced by a profound, humbling wave of regret and admiration. "The fool in this room," he said, his voice low, intended only for her, "was me. I let my pride blind me. I allowed myself to believe the easy, ugly story because it protected me from the truth, that my own house was compromised. You saw the detail no one else did. You trusted your intellect over your fear. Forgive me." Looking into his eyes, she saw not a billionaire titan, but a man brought back from the brink by an alliance he never expected. "We were both betrayed," she said softly. "The important thing is what we do now." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the first she had ever seen. It transformed his severe features into something warm and devastatingly handsome. He turned to the utterly shell-shocked Marcus Thorn. His voice rang out, filled once more with the calm, absolute authority of a king reclaiming his throne. "Now, Marcus," he said, "it seems my advisor, Ms. Vance, has just saved your company from ruin. I trust this means you will be signing our original contract without amendments, and you will add a clause dedicating 5% of the project's net profit in perpetuity to the Alistair Vance Foundation for Historical Preservation, which I am establishing this afternoon." He gestured to the chair beside him. "My advisor will show you where to sign." A month later, the air was not filtered and refrigerated, but warm, dry, and scented with wild thyme. Ilara stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking a vast, sun-drenched wadi, the very land they had fought over. The 2,000-year-old watchtower stood proudly on a nearby hill, a silent sentinel. She wore hiking boots and a practical linen shirt, not a uniform or a suit. Kaelin came to stand beside her, handing her a bottle of cool water. The deal with Thorn had been signed. Faris was facing international corporate espionage charges, and Ilara was no longer a consultant. Kaelin had made her the inaugural director of the Al-Jamil Cultural Heritage Division, with a budget that made her dizzy and a mandate that made her soul sing, to ensure that every Jamil Global project honored and enriched the history of the land it was built upon. This site was her first and most personal project. "He would have loved this," she said quietly, gesturing to the landscape. "My grandfather. He always said the past isn't dead. It's not even past. It's just waiting for someone to listen." "He was right," Kaelin said, his gaze not on the horizon, but on her. "You taught me to listen again, Ilara. You reminded me what the heart of the stone truly means. She had walked into a restaurant a ghost, her knowledge a silent burden. She had faced down betrayal, armed with observation and courage. The angry billionaire had been stopped in his tracks by her words, but in the ensuing silence, they had both found something far more valuable than a business deal. She had found her purpose, and he had found a truth he had almost forgotten, that the strongest foundations are not built on concrete and steel, but on the bedrock of legacy, respect, and a shared, remembered past. Together, they were not just building a resort. They were beginning to build a future that honored the generations to come.